Our next guest is the kind of guy people either love or hate. Clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson has been described as one of the most influential thinkers of our time, but also as an alt-right figurehead who spouts conspiracies. Despite what you think about him, there is no denying the professor's impact, his videos amassing more than 45 million views on YouTube.
It's an honour to have you, Professor.
A darling of cable conservatives.
And that's a much bigger risk. So.
Yes, it is.
With an almost religious following online, clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson has become something of a rock star in the crusade against political correctness.
Free speech is the mechanism by which we keep our society functioning.
The Canadian professor rising to fame in 2016 for opposing changes to the country's anti-discrimination laws.
I think this legislation is reprehensible.
Changes that effectively made it illegal not to call a trans person by their preferred gender pronoun, like ze or they.
I'd like to encourage people struggling with this to be kind as their first impulse.
Kindness is the excuse that social justice warriors use when they want to exercise control over what other people think and say.
His lectures leading to controversy on campus at the University of Toronto.
Peterson, do you have any comments on the Nazi presence at your protest?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis.
This interview on British television clocked up more than 8 million views.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now.
Dr. Peterson has been in Australia promoting his self-help book, 12 Rules for Life, at sold-out lectures around the nation. And Professor Jordan Peterson joins us now from Brisbane. Good morning to you. Thanks for being with us. As we just said, you've written a book called 12 Rules for Life. It's almost like your own 10 commandments. Now, if people were only going to read one of them, which would you say is the most important?
It's probably the rule that involves telling the truth. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie, is the most important one, I would say.
And why is that so important?
Well, because if you don't speak the truth, and if you speak things that you know to be false, then you mess up the structures of your own consciousness, and you can't hope to function effectively in the world. You have perceptual mechanisms that orient you in the world and that lay out what you see and how you act and how you react. And if you pathologize those by lying, then you disorient yourself in the world, and then terrible things will happen to you and the people around you. So at very least, you should try not to say things you know not to be false.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like anything that we want to happen. You've been called by some as one of the most influential thinkers of our time. One of your messages is about cleaning up your room. How much is that part of your overall message? Well, it's a metaphor in some sense. It's like our young people are taught constantly to, especially in universities, to go out and try to change the world. And you know, you don't know that much when you're young, but there's lots of things that you have right in front of you that are in disarray and disorder within your own life, within your own family. And you can start by practicing on things that are right within your grasp. And so this clean up your room idea has become very popular online because I make a very strong case for it, and because it's comically humble, I suppose. A lot of pressure on you. We'd like to see your room. Is it always tidy? No, I wouldn't say so. In the last 18 months, it's got rather messy because things have got beyond me to some degree, but I do make every effort I can to keep it orderly. So. Okay. Now, you say that one reason for the gender pay gap is the fact that women are agreeable. Do you think that women should be less agreeable? Well, they should be less agreeable if they want to be paid more when they're in a competitive enterprise. I mean, agreeableness has it's a big 5 personality trait. It has its utility. Agreeableness is extremely useful when you're dealing with very young children or with people who need care. That's the primary personality dimension, regulating compassion, for example. But in a competitive enterprise, then agreeableness sets you at a disadvantage, and you need to learn to be more assertive, how to stand up for yourself instead of other people, let's say. Well, that comes also to another point in your book where you say stand up straight, and that is also about being combative. Does us walking out into the world with a sort of aim to be more combative, does that make us more aggressive as a society? No, I wouldn't say it's about being more combative. It's about being more courageous. That's not the same thing. To stand up straight with your shoulders back is to actually expose the most vulnerable parts of yourself to the world. And that's a courageous act. It indicates confidence and the willingness to take risk. That's not the same as combativeness or aggression. It's competence and courage.
And those are very different things.
Now, you rose to prominence for your opposition to laws in Canada compelling people to use gender-neutral pronouns like ze or they rather than he or she. The Commonwealth Games begin here in Australia next month, and volunteers are being told not to use phrases like ladies and gentlemen or policemen to be more inclusive. What's wrong with being more inclusive?
Well, I suppose there's nothing wrong with being more inclusive, but there's plenty wrong with adopting the radical left's guidelines for linguistic conduct. And that's what I was opposing in Canada. It's these regulations policing language are part and parcel of a much broader agenda that's being pushed unbelievably hard. It's already subsumed the universities. So I don't buy the we're doing this because we're compassionate explanation in the least. I believe it's a power play on the part of the radical Marxists who've already infiltrated the universities. And so that's partly why I objected to the legal requirements being put forward in Canada.
Let's be really clear on this, because this has really been the issue that has put you in the spotlight. You are saying that if there was a trans person in one of your lectures, you would refer to them as they wanted to. It's the legislation that you don't like.
Yeah, it's the fact that the government is compelling speech. And, you know, we already have hate speech laws in Canada, and I think that was a big mistake to begin with, because God only knows who's going to define hate, but it won't be the people that you want to have define it. But to then step forward one more step and to actually regulate the content of speech, to say what people have to say, the government has crossed a line that no government should ever cross, no matter what the reason.
What do you say to people who perhaps might not be as respectful as you, and you're saying that you would call a trans person by however they wanted to be referred to? What do you say to other people who might not be respectful like that and do need the legislation to keep them in line?
They don't need that legislation. No one needs that legislation. It's terrible legislation. It's the first time in the history of English common law in Canada that the government has dared to introduce compelled speech as a requirement in our country. There's no excuse for it whatsoever. And the fact that they're using the trans population as the excuse to move this legislation forward is reprehensible as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. Even if somebody finds that really damaging to them?
Well, if they find the misuse of a pronoun damaging to them, then they have more problems than that are going to be solved by the mere reconstruction of someone else's language. Besides, it doesn't matter what the excuse is. The government has no right to compel speech. This is the thing, is that the rationale is compassion. But the impulse is totalitarian. I don't care what the rationale is. I don't care how compassionate the rationale is. The government doesn't get to regulate the content, well, of my speech anyways, because I wouldn't comply with the regulations, with the law. Not under any circumstances whatsoever. And I feel that it's the moral duty of citizens to stand up against that sort of compelled speech legislation. There's no excuse for it whatsoever.
Okay, you have really struck a nerve with people with the things that you are saying. You say that there is an epidemic of depression and aimlessness, and we don't make the case for growing up well. What is the right case?
Well, most people find the meaning in... You need a meaning in your life to offset the suffering in your life. You need a profound meaning. And most people find that meaning through the adoption of difficult responsibility, like career goals, educational goals, family, the support of a family, the establishment of a permanent relationship. We need to see those things as not only moral obligations, but as part and parcel of what it is, what gives people the courage to step forward in life. And so I'd be making a strong case for responsibility and truth as an antidote to terror and uncertainty. And it's not a finger-wagging case either. I'm not saying, look, young people, get your act together because, you know, there's something wrong with you. I'm saying there's way more to you than you know, and that if you step forward properly, you can fill a hole in the world that's exactly your shape. That'll be good for you and for everyone else. It's a very positive idea. And people are responding to it as if it's a very positive idea.
All right, we're out of time. Jordan Peterson, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks very much for the interview.
Moral, and moral, as far as I'm concerned, has to do with action, right? Because moral decisions are the decisions that you make when you're structuring action. When you decide to do one thing or another, generally you want to do things that are the best things that you can think of to do, and hence good. But sometimes you also want to do things that are the worst things you can do, you know, because you're angry or resentful or bitter. And so the moral decisions that you make that govern your actions are really the most important decisions that you make in your life. And it's not that easy to figure out how to make moral decisions. We don't have an unerring technology for that the same way as we do for, say, making decisions about empirical reality, which in some ways seem a lot simpler.
In different ways, I guess one issue that I'm having difficulty with is what a pronoun is. I think we'd all acknowledge that you have a right to force people to refer to you in certain ways. If a professor had a class and they had a student who insisted on calling them a girl when they were male, or calling them queer or something, or I can think of way worse words, they would say, well, that's not a pronoun, that's a derogatory label that's just meant to degrade me. But if, who's to say what is a pronoun? And I'm not sure that it necessarily would change if 95 or 97 friends all insisted on sort of degrading or, using that pejorative label to the person. And I think that people who are transgendered or whatever do experience when people use the wrong gender labels to them. They've experienced real prejudice. They experience it as kind of oppressive in that way. So I don't know if identity is a subject or an object, but I do know that we place important demands on one another. I don't know about nature, but I know that fundamentally, like, our society is going to work better if we respect each other, and I think history bears that out. That self-respect and allowing people's self-identification to play a role in that public aspect. We do already have limits on how people can refer to each other, and they're informed by how people want themselves to be referred to.
Okay. Well, that's a lot of questions. So, and that's, I'm not trying to be a smart aleck about that. It's just, I'm going to have to sort that out for a minute. Okay? Well, the first thing I would say is, pronouns, and I'm not a linguist, so I'm not going to be able to whip this off the top of my head, although I do know that there is a psychologist named James Pennebaker who's written a whole book on pronouns, which you might be interested in referring to, and pronouns turn out to be extraordinarily important as signifiers, but they're also part of what's called a closed linguistic category, and they don't change. And so that's something that's useful to know. But you also bring up the distinction, or the lack of distinction, or made a lack of distinction between adjectives and pronouns. And that's pretty interesting, because there's no real reason why, if you can't insist upon which pronoun I use to address you, you can't also insist on which adjective I use to address you. And there's a lot more adjectives. And so that's, because I don't see, like, if you can choose your damn pronoun, why can't you choose your adjective? I mean, adjectives are, the words you listed as pejorative were actually not pronouns, they were adjectives. And so you can object to them. And there's no shortage of times when you use a pejorative adjective to describe someone, especially if you believe that they've misbehaved. It's like, if the person can insist upon their pronoun, why can't they insist upon their adjective? And that's another part of this problem with this multiplicative complexity that isn't addressed properly within the law. With regards to respect, you said, well, human civilization progresses a lot better if we respect one another, and I actually don't believe that at all. I believe that human civilization progresses and maintains itself when we respect people who've earned respect. You don't just respect everybody randomly. Well, what the hell use is respect if you just respect people randomly? It's like inflating the currency, It's like the Simpsons episode where, Bart gets a trophy because it's every child gets a trophy day. All you do is inflate the currency. Respect is actually limited to that category of people who have earned respect in some manner. So whatever you're talking about with regards to, say, common decency between people, it's not respect. And the definitions actually matter. They matter a lot. And so I hear the respect argument all the time, but you also can't force me to respect you. You might be able to force me to act like I respect you, but you can't force me to respect you. It's just not possible. You could break me, I suppose, and then perhaps I would do it, although I can't see exactly how precisely. But so there's a number of, I get your point, and I'm not trying to denigrate it in any sense. There's a complex issue here, which is, to what degree do you allow individuals to govern the conversation that's had about them in their presence or otherwise? But I would just revert back to my original argument, which is that's a negotiation. It's either a negotiation. You got 3 states. You can negotiate with someone, you can be their slave, or you can be their tyrant.